Tonight we're very fortunate, extraordinarily fortunate, to have with us a person whom Edwin Fuelner, who founded the Heritage Foundation, one of the foremost think tanks in the United States. We're lucky to have Gregory R. Copley, who the founder of the Heritage Foundation described as America's foremost strategist. For more than 5 decades, he served as advisor on strategic issues to a large number of national, military, and intelligence leaders around the world. He's president of the International Strategic Studies Association, the Washington-based organization, and he's written 37 books. His latest is The Noble Estate, a wonderful book very much about the form of government which is so important in the world, and particularly constitutional monarchies. There is a wonderful foreword by the 28th Prime Minister, Tony Abbott, and I'm happy to, I just realised that there will be an opportunity for you, if you want to get a signed copy of this tonight, and Gregory will sign them. I think a table has been put here for that purpose. Joseph Bodansky, a New York Times best-selling author, says Gregory Copley is our, meaning American, our only living grand strategist. And for decades of service to the Ethiopian crown, he has been created the hereditary Marquess of Tana. And tonight he's accompanied by his wife, a truly distinguished American, Pamela von Gruber-Copley, who is the executive director of the Strategic Studies Association and the Marchioness of Tana. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted to tell you tonight that we have Gregory Copley to talk to us.
Former Prime Minister Abbott, David Flint, and distinguished guests, thank you for having us here today to push forward the cause of reason, tradition, and history in our country. I'm very pleased to see the progress which has been made, literally, since 1999 because of Professor Flint's specific work in pulling the anti-Republican movement, or the Save Australia movement, together. And in hearing the national, or original national anthem, when we talk about the King and long may he be victorious and happy and glorious, well, I think he is getting some of that, but probably not happy. But he has achieved great things in the few years that he's been on the throne. He has saved Britain, to say the least, from the ruin of elected government. Against their opposition to him, he nonetheless calmed the country extensively, which I think probably saved Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer's government. He undertook massively important diplomacy, literally on his own initiative, first with a state visit to Germany, where he addressed the Bundestag in German, then to France, where he addressed the combined houses of the Senate and the Assembly in French, with the French politicians turning out in suits and ties for the first time in years, and even more remarkably, constantly interrupting the King with shouts of "Vive le Roi," a slogan which had not been heard in France for many years. So the French responded appropriately by naming an airport, an international airport, after Queen Elizabeth. So the impact of his visit was profound. Similarly, his visit to Italy was significant. His opening of the CHOGM and management of the CHOGM conference in Samoa was significant. He has done a number of things. Canada has been his most important achievement, I think, apart from that, where he literally saved Canada by holding it together when it was challenged by President Trump's comments and caused disarray. Unfortunately, President Trump interfered with the electoral process, which meant that it wasn't necessarily a free and fair election. But the King was there and showed that he was there for Canada. He is King of Canada. And he feels similarly, perhaps even more strongly, about Australia. So we're fortunate in that, and his brief visit to Australia was a momentous success. Despite the government could not interfere with that popularity. So essentially, we are right to be celebrating the strength of the Australian monarchy and the monarchy of the Commonwealth at this stage. But the mandate I was given tonight was to talk about regime change, and it's one which I address in this new book, The Noble State, but it's on a different scale than you might think. It's not about just coups d'etat and the inevitable manipulation of governments through electoral or non-electoral processes. It's about the greater sweep of history, where for the past 300 years we have seen industrialisation and urbanisation gather pace at an unprecedented level in human history. All of these cycles of human behaviour are cyclical, and we can read the future in those cycles. But the level of urbanisation, for example, the result of industrialisation to a large degree, is such that we are now seeing a growth from an average of 5 to 10% of the world's population in urban societies at the turn of the 20th century to something like 65% globally today, 87% in Australia, 85% in the US. And this changes the way people look at things. What we saw with industrialisation was this movement towards short-term transactional, materialistic dealings. And as we moved into cities, we saw our natural relationship with the countryside erode and, to a degree, disappear. That in itself ended up killing off clans, killing off the small n nations of groups of kindred people. We saw that with urbanisation, the conditions for the basis of our logic change. Logic is that ability that we have devised to survive in our particular geographical circumstances. And what happened was that in the countryside, we knew when to plant and when to sow and reap rather, and we knew all about the terroir, which in a sense governed our lives. But when we moved into an increasingly concrete jungle, we saw that our kinship with the land was changed. It's not that we didn't reflect the physical nature of the land around us, we did, but that meant that we didn't have to worry about when we planted or reaped our crops. It meant we had to be careful about what we said and what we did and how we reacted among our peers, whether we were on the politically correct side of any discussion or whether we questioned the policies and the natures and mores of our society. As a result, we started to polarise our communities. The cities and the countryside divided. Under democratic government, and I'm not as big a fan of it as Professor Flint, with our present form of democracy, we started to count votes instead of counting history, counting the wealth of our land, counting the necessity of our natural resources, whether mineral or agricultural, to our survival and our independence. There is no sovereignty when you can be held to ransom for your food, such as the People's Republic of China is today. There's no sovereignty when you cannot either provide enough energy or process that energy. So we have to look at where Australia is today. When I was growing up here, Australia rode to wealth on the back of the sheep. The wool industry is almost gone entirely, almost entirely. The fat lamb trade has gone almost entirely, largely because of the banning of live sheep exports and the like, and the restrictions on abattoirs and the restrictions on moving product abroad. All of these things can be changed, but we have to recognise what led us to this impasse. In 1917, Oswald Spengler wrote The Decline of the West in German. It was first published in German, not into English until the 1920s. But he was talking about the impact of what he translated from German into English as the megalopolis, the grand ultra-cities, which were taking over and changing the thought of societies. And right now, we are seeing the impact of that. We saw as a result that the 20th century, a century marked by the creation of these new modern facile countries called republics, was that we started going into this short-term thinking or non-thinking, in which we were caused to follow populist movements. We saw the fascist movement, the Nazi movement, the communist movement as the Soviets portrayed it and the like. And these were movements which insisted that democracy be only a word and that the social contract, which should have led countries to aspire to their great values and their great sense of nobility, merit and decency, just were masses of people who were repeating slogans, and Lenin himself said, if I can reduce any argument to a slogan, I have won the crowd. And that's true in a society which has no compass, whether moral or geographic, because it doesn't know where its food comes from, it doesn't know its long-term goals, and it doesn't remember the lessons of its people. And the Soviet Union pioneered a thing which my long associate, Dr. Stefan Pisoni, called Umvolkung, which is basically the destruction of nations. Again, the small n nations, peoples who had their own languages, cultures, and modes of life, art forms, music, language, within the boundaries of the Soviet Union, which took over the old Russian Empire. And the Chinese communists followed suit. The Soviets wanted to create new Soviet man, in other words, somebody who had no connection with the past. The Chinese communists have said the same. So essentially, we're in this situation where we are being not only encouraged, but being forced to abandon our ideals, our merit, our leadership sense, our nobility, in order to fit into the society and to eat and get a job and to pay for the rent. So all of this has led to this mass movements, as we were talking about, where the globalist phenomenon, in other words, the people who don't believe in the dignity of the individual nation or even of the nation state or even of the civilizations, all of which are progressions from our natural life. They believe in momentum to roll over boundaries, borders and the like, to reduce us to a common language, a common ideology and the like. And these mass movements, again, not unheard of in previous history. You remember the Children's Crusade of the 12th century, I think it was, where you had a Greta Thunberg type person leading people to have a crusade in the Holy Land. All of these things have mass appeal and a lot of momentum until they run out of steam. And the fascists in Italy, the Nazis in Germany, ran out of steam by military conquest. The Soviet Union ran out of speed and steam because it ran out of internal capacity and ran out of leaders who had basically hardened their skills in the purges. But when these mass movements, the globalist mass movements, run out of momentum, they collapse very, very suddenly. And they always, as they start to frighten their neighbours, they generate a nationalist response. So this whole nationalist, globalist confrontation we see in various forms and in most countries of the world is an inevitable process of all of this. Now, what we're seeing with this is that, as Professor Flint just mentioned, was that we've seen the decline in countries who abide by a social contract, whether it's electoral or whether it's defined by history, such as monarchies. What we see is that we end up with a society which is very short-term and transactional. Give me this, and I'll give you this if you vote for me, type of thing. So we see this gradual reduction in the moral value of society. What we've now started to see, though, is that the totalitarian mass movements are becoming confronted by increasingly serious nationalist movements. And nationalist movements have their own problems because they are also gathering short-term support. But in the process of all this over the past 300 years of urbanisation and industrialisation and short-term material thinking, which Dickens himself, Charles Dickens, decried, saying no cities have ever produced anything worth a jot. But he basically saw the turning away from the old form monarchies, which had largely become moribund in many cases because they hadn't modernised, they hadn't taken to heart their social contract, and we saw the rise of the republics. Now, in line with the thinking of people like Glub Pasha, for example, the former great military leader of Jordan, who said that empires and great societies have a lifespan generally of about 250 years on average. We're now seeing, after 300 years of this whole republican surge, that republics themselves have lost their way. They have become, as the 1999 referendum pointed out, become very, very venal, short-term and materialistic in their appeal to politicians who want power, regardless of whether or not they know what to do with, or regardless of whether they have a concrete vision for their country. And we're now seeing that all starting to collapse. And concurrently, this is all part of the same process. These mass movements have spelled the end of political parties, modern political parties as we know them. There have always been political parties throughout history, but what we're seeing today is something which Edmund Burke discussed in about 1850, which is the crowd is in the street. I must go out in front of them if I'm to be their leader. In other words, the crowd knows where it's going, but if you're in front of them, you can be their leader without even knowing what they're standing for. And so today, most political parties stand for very little. They don't have long-term vision. They don't have a long-term ethical basis and foundation. And they basically founder, as we see in many of the debates of societies around the world. So we're seeing this situation where the political parties literally have become froth on the headwaters of the nationalist and globalist movements, and nobody is moving yet to that next phase of the role of constitutional monarchies. And as we lose these monarchies, we see that the happiness of countries suffers enormously, and we know that some of the wealthiest countries and countries which describe themselves as the happiest are almost all constitutional monarchies. Now, to get to the point of regime change, because I know we're going to discuss it in Iran, I worked with the Shah for a long time, well, some years, before he left the country in 1979. I left just 2 weeks before him. There's a chance there for the revival of decency, just as there's a chance for the revival of decent government in China, or at least parts of China, and in many other countries, including Australia. And it may be easier to see a restoration of a degree of tradition, culture, and values in countries like Iran or Persia, and in the People's Republic of China, which will hopefully not be the People's Republic of China much longer, because the whole apparatus is swept away. And the collapse of the Soviet Union actually gave us a great lesson in that, because it's got a head start in restoring its national cultures and values. It's respecting its history. It's actually reversing, because you've got a strongly anti-communist government, whether you like the Putin form of governance or not. It's an anti-communist government which is basically trying to restore a lot of its traditional values. Now, that will go through another phase because there's no succession process in place for the Putin government at the moment. Similarly, there's no, but it did have a collapse, and it did have this massive revival, and that'll continue, I would think. In the case of Iran, I think we are going to see a revival, Whether it's the restoration of the Pahlavi dynasty or not, we will hear later tonight, but I like that. I was going to say a great supporter and advisor and a friend and supporter of the Shah. But what will normally happen in Iran, as has happened historically, is that you don't see the new leader until he's right at your doorstep. And Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi basically has a lot of baggage which he was forced to inherit in the years since the clerics took over. So whether he can sustain government or whether he can merely facilitate a new transition when we see this final collapse of the clerical government is debatable, but I would assume that the next stage could be the same as happened in 1925 when Reza Shah the Great, the general with General Fazlollah Zahdi, basically conquered all the tribes or reconquered all the tribes and restored governance, and Reza Shah was declared the Shah of Iran. Now, I think that's what's going to happen again. We're going to see someone emerge, probably from the armed forces or from the even from the Revolutionary Guard, because they're all fairly, shall we say, pragmatic, and they understand that what makes Iran tick, and they know that if you put your head above the parapets too early in this race for succession, it'll be shot. So basically we're going to see these sort of things. But we're seeing this all over the world now because this whole phenomenon, which I say is unique in history, has become so urbanized, so modern, so technologically reliant with social media and the like, that you can institute the collapse of governments and the rise of new leaders very, very quickly. Problem is, in countries like Australia, where and I'm sure Mr. Abbott will disagree, the whole process of preferential voting has meant that we haven't seen many governments which have more than a third of the primary vote of the Australian voters. And yet we see referendums which are definitely, in a sense, singular first past the post votes. We see that referendums generally show about a two-third decision for a momentum like the ending of the process for the voice, for example. So we know that there's a great disconnect between preferential voting systems, which give you continuity and stability, but remove many of the freedoms and attempt, as we see in their maturity, to erode the contact of the people with the Crown. And the Crown is there to represent the ideals of society, not to govern the country. It represents values, it's our values which we feel are being represented by the monarch, and we can get about our lives, flawed as they may be, but the monarch, hopefully is not seen in human terms in that sense, is the one who is the repository of values, of history, of language, of decency and behaviour and ethics, and of course nobility. So we're going to see these transitions occurring. Australia is going to be a difficult country to bring into the 21st century simply because we've inherited systems which are difficult to change, and I've got ideas for that, but basically we have to be very careful that our freedoms and our prerogatives and our social contract with our leader, which is also a social contract with our brethren in terms of our understanding of culture, to be maintained. And and I did a study in 2005 called Australia 2050, looking at where Australia should be by 2050, asking every Australian we could find, what is an Australian, what is Australia, where do you want to be by mid-century? The only value which could be ascribed to Australians, by Australians, was the trait of mateship. Nice, but we found out during the COVID crisis that mateship didn't count for a lot. We saw a breakdown in that great stoicism and great mateship, a great sense of independence of the Australian population. And asked where we wanted to be in 2050, everyone said the same, only richer. Nobody described anything to do with ethics, values, or our role and duty as individuals and as a society in the safeguarding of this in the Indo-Pacific region, which arguably we should be the host, and particularly of Antarctica, which is now coming up for the end of the Antarctic Treaty, and we're seeing open season being declared on Antarctica. It's terra nullius again, no man's land. Australia has the greatest responsibility there. The Russians, the Chinese particularly are in there, Indian government as well, and we're seeing this situation where the Russians just announced that they've discovered a reserve of 511 billion barrels of oil in the Weddell Sea in the British sector. They shouldn't even been allowed under the treaty to explore that, and yet we know what's going to happen next. We're seeing other computerized industrial processing capabilities now being done in factories in Antarctica very discreetly, again in violation of the treaty. And what is Australia doing about it? Nothing, because we have no vision. There has not been a long-range plan for Australia and the nature of Australians for, well, ever, actually. And I decry the missed opportunity of our great World War I general who should have perhaps taken a more political role. But we are a country like Iran in many respects, which is quietly going about its business and not necessarily fomenting revolution, and that's probably a good thing, but we're also allowing ourselves to be hijacked, as the Iranian people have been for the past 45 or so years, since 1979. Now with that, can I wrap up? Is it time for questions, or do we do... Okay, thank you very much indeed.